Well, it's an honor to be here. First of all, thank you, Chris and Val, for putting this together. It's wonderful how much I have learned in the last 2 days, and it's a little scary to follow her, to follow Esther, and to be here, and a little bit kind of what Daniela was saying yesterday, since I certainly come from a very Western science perspective on all of this. Give you a little bit of my background. I grew up in Nebraska, went to college in Denver and Utah, and then made my way to the Willamette Valley to the University of Oregon in 2002 to do my dissertation work with Kathy Whitlock, who Frank mentioned earlier, who really is the fire history, or was when she was still there. She's now at Montana State, guru at the University of Oregon. So when I first got to the Valley in 2002, oh, there she is. Esther, I just wanted to thank you very much for telling us those wonderful stories, and I'm honored to follow you and talk about the fire history of the Calapooya in the Willamette Valley. And I hope I do it justice. And coming from a Western science perspective, I hope that I can at least incorporate. I'll come back to something you said in a few minutes, because I was very, very glad to hear you say it, because it's kind of been my theory all along, and yeah, I'll come back to that, so thank you. But the reason I got interested in trying to understand the fire history of the Willamette Valley was because when I came here in 2002, my advisor Kathy said to me, look at the oaks, aren't they beautiful? Which is why I have this beautiful picture of one of the oaks from Mount Pisgah, which actually, funny, isn't standing there anymore. It's only half standing there now because it was struck by lightning a couple years ago, which, oddly enough, when I first moved here, people said, oh, fire doesn't happen in the valley naturally. We never get lightning strikes. And now my favorite oak tree has been struck by lightning. So just keep that in mind as we go along. But my advisor said, look at the oak trees, look all along the hill slopes, and look how crowded they are now with conifers. Look how all of what used to be oak savanna, used to be oak woodland, is now really being choked to death by Douglas fir and grand fir, and that's really due to the removal of fire from the landscape. But what we don't know is how much of that was Native American fire on the landscape, and really how much of that was natural fire. So, you really should do a dissertation topic, or, a dissertation study on this topic. And I said, okay, I think I will. So first of all, though, I wanted to give you a little bit of a history or background into what paleoecology is, and I know Frank was mentioning it this morning, but I wanted to give you an idea kind of how it works, just in case people have never heard of paleoecology before, because otherwise you start looking at the graphs I'm going to show you and it's just probably mumbo jumbo. So people who use paleoecology are using bioindicators. They're using things that were living on the landscape and sensing climate, sensing the environment in which they were living, and using them as indicators of past climate to get an understanding of what those climates were like. So the two things that I look at are pollen and charcoal, as Frank was mentioning, to reconstruct past environments, and in this case trying to understand what climate was telling them to do, where to grow, how often to burn, versus also what then was the human relationship with those environments. So pollen, I think, is absolutely beautiful. It's amazing to look at under a microscope. It's produced by all of the flowering plants that are out there on our landscape. And great for us that most pollen is unique. You can see all of the different forms that it takes here. We've got a sunflower pollen here. We've got some pine pollen. This is a Douglas fir pollen up here on the left-hand side. And when you look at it under a microscope, you can compare it to reference collections in books or on slides, and you can identify which plants it's coming from. These are images from a scanning electron microscope over here on the right. So I just put a couple of my favorite ones up here. You can see a dogwood pollen up there on the left-hand side. There's the Douglas fir one again. There's actually a hemlock grain, western hemlock, a big leaf maple down there. Hang on. Unfortunately, however, pollen isn't always identifiable to the species level. Sometimes it's only to the genus level. Sometimes it's only to the family level. So it's not always totally telling us exactly what species was growing in an area. Like with Douglas fir, unfortunately, larch pollen and Douglas fir pollen looks exactly the same. So you can't always tell the two species apart, but you can oftentimes find macrofossils or the needles from those plants in lake sediments as well, which I'll get to here in a second. Grass is usually only identifiable to the family level. Grass is grass is grass. So when you find grass pollen, all you know is that it was a grass. Although maize pollen, which is in the grass family, is huge. It's just basically a really, really big form of grass pollen. And so you can actually pick out when maize agriculture started in many places, like down in Mexico or in the desert Southwest. So it is good for that. There's a fir pollen grain and things like hardtack. So that's one of these bioindicators that I look at. The other thing I do is try to reconstruct fire history, because obviously as vegetation is changing on the landscape through time, fire is also occurring, and it's changing along with the vegetation as it's changing. So 3 main ways that you can reconstruct fire history: either historical records, which is people writing down when fires happen, making maps out of them. You can see an example. Here's the really bad fire year in the West, 1910. There's a fire atlas from the northern Rocky Mountains, and you can see the red is showing you where all the fires were. Those are great, and they're really specific, but they only go back about 100 years, so they're not useful back past that time period. As Frank was talking about, and as some other people have mentioned, fire scars are great because you can slice open trees or get biscuits from the trunks, and you can see all of the fire scars that have burned those trees, and you can actually count back the rings and get the actual years when those fire events happened. And again, that's great, but you're limited by the age of the trees, or the trees that we have remaining out on the landscape. Usually in the Willamette Valley, in our area, that's only a couple hundred years because most areas have been logged. So, and they decay, the trunks, the stumps decay really fast. So what are you left with then to reconstruct fire history? Well, what we then use are macroscopic pieces of charcoal that accumulate in lake sediments. And the reason we use what we call macroscopic charcoal, or pieces that are larger than 125 microns, is because studies have shown is that these bigger pieces, not tiny, tiny little pieces of charcoal, but charcoal that you can actually see with the naked eye, don't go as far after a fire. They don't go more than like a mile. Right? Because these tiny, tiny little microscopic pieces of charcoal have been shown to go, hundreds of miles. Like forests or fires that burn in New Zealand, the charcoal ends up over in Australia. So if you're counting these tiny pieces of charcoal, you don't know where your fire history is coming from. So if you look at these bigger pieces of charcoal, you're actually reconstructing a local fire history or a watershed fire history. So the idea is that as long as a lake has been out there on the environment, a lake or a bog or a wetland, something that has water in it, as long as that body of water has been standing there, everything that's falling onto that lake surface, pollen coming from the trees, charcoal coming from the vegetation that burns, falls on top of the lake, sinks down to the bottom, and gets incorporated into the mud or the sediment at the bottom of the lake. So we then go out and build, and I think you saw a picture earlier, we build these floating platforms, go out and anchor ourselves down to the center of the lakes, and we send these coring devices, usually just these handheld coring devices. This is an example not from the Willamette Valley, but from the Siskiyous, where Frank was talking about. This is actually Christy Briles, who you were talking about. I was helping her core one of her lakes. We send it down to the bottom of the lake, and basically you just take these vertical tubes of mud from the top of the water, where you meet the sediment, all the way down to the bedrock, with the idea that right where the sediment meets the top of the water is present, and where you go all the way down and the sediment meets the bedrock, that's the oldest that you get. That's where the lake started, or when the lake formed. Okay, so this is the handheld, what we call a Livingston piston core, that we use to actually capture the sediment. And you can see it's just a hollow tube that has this piston that goes up the middle. And basically you just take it, after you get the mud in it, you just take it and squeeze the tube of mud out. And this is what it looks like when it comes out. I've actually split it down the middle. It's usually a solid tube, but this is actually back in the lab, and we've split it open. You can see the middle there. And then we take it and we sample it into tiny, tiny little segments. And you can imagine that, again, at the top of the core is the present, and as you move down this core, you just get older and older and older going back in time. So this is one of my students at the University of Oregon helping me sample this, because for charcoal, which is what we're interested in, like Frank was mentioning, we have to sample every centimeter within that core, either every half centimeter or every centimeter interval, because the idea is you count a cubic centimeter worth of mud from every single centimeter within that core, because charcoal is always there. It's always there and it's always changing. So you want to count how the abundance of that charcoal changes through time, with the idea being that when fires occur, you get peaks in those charcoal counts. Okay? With pollen, however, pollen changes more slowly throughout the core because vegetation changes more slowly, right? Especially trees. Trees live for hundreds of years, so you don't need to pull pollen samples from every centimeter. You pull them every 5 centimeters, every 10 centimeters, with the hope that you're reconstructing vegetation every, 50 years, every 100 years, something like that. Okay, so this is all very labor intensive, but here's what you're looking at, the charcoal and the pollen. The other thing, let me mention, because you're going to see this in a minute, is that I was keeping track as I was going along under the microscope when you're actually counting the charcoal. It's keeping track of the difference between woody charcoal, which is just normal charcoal from wood, versus what looks like herbaceous charcoal, or charcoal coming from things like grasses and herbs. And the way you tell the difference is just, I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you can see, there's little holes in between, in the charcoal over here on the right-hand side. And that's just where the stomates used to be, right? That's just where the guard cells were opening and closing and letting the herbaceous, the grass, respirate through those stomates, okay? So if we can count the different proportions of those different kinds of charcoal, not only can we reconstruct fire frequency through time, but we can also get an idea of what was burning, right? And start to think about not only were we having fires, but what kind of fires were they? Were they low intensity ground fires, or were they big, huge stand destroying fires on the landscape? So I'll come back to that in a second. All right, so you guys probably know what radiocarbon dating is, but you got to understand, when we go out and take these lake sediment cores, if we don't know what time period we're talking about, they don't mean anything, right? So as we're going along, we have these big tubes of mud. We pull out things like needles, chunks of charcoal, leaves, chunks of wood, and we send them off for AMS radiocarbon dating so that we can build a chronology to the core and know what time periods we're talking about. So there's just the steps that you go through, pre-treatment, combustion, and then they get run through an AMS detector. I don't do these things except for finding the AMS samples, and then I send them off to a lab to get radiocarbon dated. But just as an example, this is then what an age model for a sediment core looks like. The way to read this is, here's present over here at 0 at the top. Here's 12,000 years ago, and we're looking at age just in calendar years before present. That's how I'm going to show you most of the ages throughout the talk. Okay, and then here's the depth of that core. So just imagine this is that mud I was showing you from the top of the mud all the way down to the bottom of the mud, and the one core I'm going to spend the most time talking about was 8.5 meters long. Okay, so that's like 26 feet long of mud straight down into that lake. Right? So each one of these little black things that you see on here represents a radiocarbon date, and then this smooth curve that goes through it is that age model, or those ages that I fit to all of the depths in that mud. So we used carbon-14 dating for most of those, but when you get up to the top of the core, if you know with radiocarbon dating, you can't use it for the last couple hundred years because of all the bomb explosions that have been going on that have messed up the amount of radiocarbon in the atmosphere. So we actually use lead-210 dating instead, which actually has a much shorter half-life, and it allows us to date just the last couple hundred years. So that's how we can have a really nice age control on just those very top sediments in our cores. So, okay, so back to the Willamette Valley. Hang on. All right, so back to why I chose this topic. Like I said, when I came into the valley, it was very quickly impressed upon me that obviously the landscape that we see today looks very, very different than it did 150 years ago. We know from General Land Office surveys done in the 1800s to the 1850s that we had lots and lots of oak savanna, which is what you're seeing in the orange color, right, across much of the valley. And this is kind of the valley portion over here. The Cascades are what you're seeing in green. We had lots of wet prairie and grassland, which is the yellow colors that you're seeing across much of the valley. And then as you moved up into the Cascades to the east and the Coast Range to the west, you had the closed conifer, the closed forest environments. And then if you look at the landscape today, obviously there's not much of that left. You can find little pockets of remnant vegetation, but for the most part we have orchards, lots of turf grass growing, lots of Christmas tree farms, things like that. But in those few places, and I don't need to tell you guys this, usually this is for people when I'm giving this talk in other places who have never even heard of the Willamette Valley or don't even know what our landscape looks like. But you guys know that in those small pockets where we have just a little bit of wet prairie left, or we have a little bit of oak savanna left, it doesn't look the same, right? It doesn't have that same openness to it. Those riparian areas are choked with woody species. Those oak savannas are crowded by Douglas fir and crowded by all those other conifers, right? In the 1850s, we had the oak savanna, we had the wet prairie, but today, and I apologize for kind of my dark picture, but you can see here's your oak trees up front, and then you can see all the conifers have just taken over that canopy and are just crowding everything out of there. And again, this is from Mount Pisgah, which is one of my favorite places to go actually see some oak savanna. So we know it's our good friend Smokey the Bear, right? We know that it's 20th century fire suppression that's led to these changes, right? That's caused this overcrowding, that's caused these few small pockets of remnant vegetation to be dramatically different than they were 150 years ago. That's led to this conifer encroachment in oak savanna. But we also know, and many people have talked about prescribed burning and adding fire back to the landscape, and I'm certainly an advocate of that. We know, and this is not the same location as the picture before, this is back down in Mount Pisgah where they have done prescribed burning, they have done fire treatments. We know when we add fire back to the landscape that it opens up, that it does return back to this oak woodland, this oak savanna. So the question is, and again, kind of going back to my dissertation topic, we know Native Americans have been here, and they've been here for 10,000 years, probably longer. We know that they've been using fire just like Native Americans were using fire in many, many other cultures, like you have the famous Remington painting on the left-hand side showing the use of fire on the Great Plains. We know that the Kalapuya were using fire in the Willamette Valley, just like Esther was mentioning. Here's where I'm going to link back to her story. One of the first kind of things that was impressed upon me when I moved here that I got from reading the literature, that I got from talking to people, was that people would say, oh yeah, the Kalapuyans, they were burning the valley. They were burning the whole valley every year, all the time, and then when settlement happened, it stopped. And I just kind of thought, really? They were burning the whole valley? The whole thing? Just up in flames every year? And that's really, after reading through all of the literature, that's what people made it sound like. And I just didn't really understand where they were getting that from. And especially after driving through the valley so much, looking for my field sites that I'm going to show you, I just didn't see how that was possible, especially with how varied the valley is, with how many hills and drainages and valleys and kind of little microclimates and things like that. I just didn't see how that was possible, especially, again, going back to what Esther told us, how there were so many different tribes and so many different family groups. I didn't think, they all just got together and set the whole valley on fire. So I wanted to see if we could figure out really what was the spatial scale of that burning. How far back through time could we see that this burning has been going on? And really, could we start to sort out what has been the Native American burning on the landscape versus what climate's been doing naturally, because we can't forget about climate. Climate has still been here causing fire and also causing climatic changes, making things cooler and wetter and hotter and drier over the last 10,000 years, you know, at the same time. So this is where I was going, and it's all been a kind of a very complicated, but you know, what dissertation topic isn't complicated? So, oh, and I don't need to tell you guys, but I always like to put the camas in there, reminding people that they had a good reason to burn, right? They were stimulating the growth of important crops, like or important root crops in this case, like the camas, or herding game, or clearing trails, or stimulating acorn growth, or whatever it was. So, all right, so this is, I'm going to try not to kill you with graphs in this talk, but like I said, we can't forget that climate has been consistently changing, and I made my little plea for climate change yesterday, that climate is constantly changing. That's what we know, and certainly now, because of humans, climate is changing much more rapidly. But let me explain this figure real quick, because I think it sums up very well what's gone on. Here's the present over here. Here's 0, where we are right now. Here's 25,000 years ago, and if you know anything about climate history, 25,000 years ago was the end of the last glacial period that we had. We were just coming out of it about 20,000 years ago, actually. And then since then, we've just kind of been coming out of that last glacial maximum and getting actually warmer till about 10,000 years ago, and then actually been getting cooler up until present. So here's time on this axis. These are the months of the year, so there's January, June, July, and then there's December over there. And then this third axis that you see here is actually insolation. So just the amount of incoming solar radiation, or the amount of sunshine that we're getting here at 45 degrees north, which is pretty much where we are right now, just measured in watts per meter squared. Okay? So what do you notice about 10,000 years ago? What happens here? Yeah, there's a big spike, right? There's a big spike during the summer months, right? We're getting a lot more insolation during the summer months during that time, right? That's called the early Holocene warm period. So during the summer months, we're getting a lot more summer drought. You guys think we have drought today during the summer? Try 10,000 years ago. Yeah, it was really warm and really dry. And what we're going to see here in a second when I show you the vegetation records from the valley is that the vegetation was completely different during that time. Tons of oak savanna all over the place. Very, very drought-adapted plants because of this. And then since that time, over the last 10,000 years, we've really only gotten cooler and wetter as a result in this changing insolation. And this all has to do with the orbital parameters of the Earth, basically the way the Earth is facing the sun at different times throughout the year. Okay, so we've got changing climate, and then we've got humans living here, right? And this is just, again, this is what Esther was saying, is that it's all collectively called the Kalapuya, but we know that there were all these different tribes living in the valley, that they were split basically along the river, that they had territory from the Willamette up into the foothills of the Cascades and the Coast Range, and that they moved seasonally, that they gathered things at different times throughout the year, that they were using fire on the landscape. So keep that in your mind too as we go along. And then the other big thing we know, and this was kind of, again, what I was expecting to see in the charcoal record somewhere, that if Native Americans were using fire and using it a lot, that when the big population decline came along with disease, and somebody else mentioned this yesterday, that when disease came along in the late 1700s, although some people say it was earlier, and I'm going to try to make a case that I think it was actually earlier that it came through, that if people were using fire up until that point, that we should see fire, 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 and then a big drop off and no fire. Okay? And we're going to see that it's kind of a mixed bag, some of my conclusions that I came to. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time. I've completely lost track, so you just, give me the sign when to stop. So, all right, so one of the reasons I found out why no one had done this dissertation topic yet is because there aren't a lot of lakes to core in the Willamette Valley. So I spent an entire summer out there scouting sites to take lake sediment cores out of. And what I found, this site up here, Battleground Lake, was actually Kathy Whitlock, my advisor's dissertation site from 30 years ago. It's a remnant volcanic crater. It's actually a state park in Washington. And I got to make a note here. Many people think that the Willamette Valley stops at the Columbia River. It's actually not true. Can you see that the structural depression keeps going until basically here? So it's part of the Willamette Valley. That's why it's in my study, but it is a crater up here. So I'm going to talk about that when we actually went up and took a new sediment core out of it. So the pollen work is hers. The charcoal work is mine. Actually took a lake sediment core out of Lake Oswego. Anybody been to Lake Oswego? Yeah? Have you actually swam in Lake Oswego or anything? No, it's a private lake, right? Yeah, I had to get permission from the Lake Oswego Corporation to take a core out of Lake Oswego. Got a really great core. We've got a 3,500-year-long record from Lake Oswego. I'll show you that in a minute. Beaver Lake, just 5 miles from here in the middle of a farmer's field. Again, another student did the pollen work on this for their master's work at Oregon. Turns out, hit the jackpot with Beaver Lake. It's actually an oxbow lake that ended up being 11,000 years old. That's about as old as you get in the Willamette Valley because the Missoula floods came down up until about 12,000 years ago, ponded up, made Lake Allison, and then, went away. And so to find an oxbow lake that's 11,000 years old, I mean, really, that's as old as you get. So we went back, took a new core. He did the pollen. I did the charcoal and the new core. We're able to correlate the two together. Porter Lake is another little oxbow lake, not far from Beaver Lake, but this one's only 300 years old. But you're going to see it has a nice, really nice record from before Euro-American settlement to after. Warner Lake is just up into the Coburg Hills east of Eugene and sits on Roseboro Lumber Company land, and it's a landslide dam lake. It has a 1,000-year-long record out of it, and it's important because it sits right on the ecotone between closed conifer forest and what used to be oak woodland. So, okay. Oh, and I got ahead of myself. This is what this map is showing you, that all of these different colors were all of those different prairie oak opening, oak forest, Douglas fir forest. So I was trying to get a range of sites down through the valley. These were the 5 I came up with. I know there's a hole here in the middle. I tried coring so many different wetlands that didn't work out, that didn't have sediment in it, that have been disturbed. I'm not saying that 5 sites covers the whole valley. This is just all I could do for my dissertation. I would love if you know of more sites that are hidden in people's fields or on their property or whatever, please let me know. But yeah, it took me 6.5 years to do my dissertation, so this is what I got. But you can see they come from very different environments, so I felt like I was really lucky to have such a wide range of ecosystems represented by these sites. Okay, so let's talk about Battleground because it has such a lovely, wonderful record in it. Like I said, it's a state park. You can go camp on it. You can go fish. There used to be a floating dance hall on top of it with a roller rink and water slides, all this crazy stuff back in the 1920s. It has a wonderful history to it. You can see today it has a second or a third growth forest. I can't remember, but it's at least a second growth forest. It was logged back in the 1870s. And it is a little volcanic crater, and you can see lots of farmers' fields then out around of it. It's just kind of north of the Vancouver area. All right, so this is a typical pollen diagram, and I know Frank showed one earlier. Thing to see here is that, again, time is over here. Here's the present at the top, 0. Here's 16,000 years ago in terms of age, calendar years. And these are all pollen species across the top, so different types of trees and plants. And they're all percentages. So basically all you have to do is look at the black bars and how far they go to the right. And it's just telling you spruce, pine, grass, sedge, hemlock, Douglas fir, bracken fern, whatever. So I kind of summed it up into these different categories over here. So 16,000 to 14,000 years ago, it was this open pine spruce parkland. After that, it transitioned to this Douglas fir, kind of willow alder forest. The important one, remember I told you that early Holocene warm period? Look what the vegetation does. It switches to this kind of oak savanna open forest with lots of Douglas, well, a little bit less Douglas fir, but red alder, and like I said, for the first time, the oak comes in there. So it really is making a big switch when climate switches to much warmer and drier. And then here's the other important thing. About 5,000 years ago, Cupressaceae comes in, which is the cedar family. So western red cedar, incense cedar comes in. 5,000 years ago, we see this all over the Pacific Northwest. That's when we get the forest that we have today. 5,000 years ago, that's when we get the wet, cold Pacific Northwest forest that we're used to. Okay? So that's what the vegetation, and lots of Douglas fir and cedar. Okay? So that's what the vegetation was doing at this site. So like I said, I went back, I got a new core, and I counted 1,400 charcoal samples all throughout this 8.5 meter long core. And that's what these little squiggly lines over here are. Here's the last 14,000 years. Only line you need to pay attention to is this pink line here. And all it's done is it's taken all my counts, which are the squiggly lines. It's statistically calculated the number of fire episodes, or basically the number of times the peaks in those charcoal counts get high enough above a background. And it summed them into that pink line, which is the number of fire episodes per 1,000 years. Okay, so you notice down here, when vegetation is that pine parkland, it's really dry and cold, look how low fire episodes are. You basically have no fire, which makes sense. We're coming out of the last glacial. There's pretty much no vegetation on the landscape, and there's pretty much no fire. It's too cold, it's too dry, there's nothing to burn. Right? But look, as you get into this Douglas fir forest coming in, and then look especially as you get into this oak savanna, look what happens. Fire frequency gets all the way up to like 16 fire episodes per 1,000 years. And actually, I think that's even a low estimate. I don't think we could actually pick out all of the fire episodes. See how they're all kind of scrunched together here? And the other thing to point out, remember I told you I was keeping track of the difference between herbaceous charcoal and woody charcoal. Look at how much more herbaceous charcoal there was during the fire events that were going on during this oak savanna time period. That says these are low severity ground fires going on when it's oak savanna. Okay? And the other line you can look at here is fire magnitude. These are tiny little ground fires going on versus, look at the last 4,500 years then. Fire frequency drops. So we're getting fewer and fewer fires as it's getting cooler and wetter. Okay, that makes sense. But look what fire magnitude does. You see how those bars get much, much taller there? Yeah, so we're getting fewer fires, but when the fires are burning, they're huge. They're burning down the entire forest. They're happening every 500 years. That makes sense, right? That's kind of the natural fire regime we expect in Douglas fir wet cedar forests, okay? And not really a lot of herbaceous charcoal. That's back here when it's this oak savanna, okay? So to me, Battleground Lake, part of the Willamette Valley, to me, this is a climate-driven system. Maybe back here when it was an oak savanna, maybe this was humans helping set these low severity ground fires. We have no way of knowing. There is no archaeologic record from Battleground. There has been nothing found in the crater, near the crater. Only archaeologic sites in this area are along the river systems, and they're all very recent. So I'm not saying that there isn't a human history here somewhere. It's just we don't really need to invoke humans to help explain this story. It very much seems to be a climate-driven story. Okay, let me skip this for now, just in terms of time. That's the recent stuff. Let me switch over real quick to Beaver Lake. Okay, Beaver Lake is the one that's just a couple miles from here in the middle of a farmer's field. Here's actually the map showing you the 1850s General Land Office vegetation cover. Lots of oak savanna. Lots of prairie surrounding this oxbow, and here it is in 2000. You can see all the farmers' fields out there around it. Okay, I'm not going to show you everything I showed you for Battleground. All I want to show you, this is that same kind of pollen diagram. The only thing I want you to look at, this, like I said, this lake's 11,000 years old. Only thing I want you to see is that about 8,000 years ago, again during that early Holocene warm period, before that, here during the early Holocene warm period, we've got lots of red alder, lots of corylus, which is hazelnut, and lots of oak. Okay, so really dry, really warm. After 8,000 years, we get this big switch to all these riparian taxa, willow, hardhack, ash, all your riparian taxa come in, all your wet prairie taxa come in, and this switches over to just kind of this oxbow, riparian zone. All right? That's what the vegetation did. Only switched once at 8,000 years ago. Here's what the fire did, though. This is, remember the pink line I showed you before for fire frequency? This is that same thing, it's just blue now. Okay, so there's fire frequency at Beaver Lake for the last 1,000 years. Doesn't look the same, does it? It peaks about 10,000 years ago. Okay, good. Peaks during the early Holocene warm period. That makes sense. But then it drops off when kind of the vegetation switches. But then look what fire frequency does over the next 8,000 years. It increases. Now, how can fire frequency increase when all climate is doing is getting cooler and wetter? You guys tell me. Yeah, that's the conclusion I came to. Let's put Battleground up there next to it. That's the one that I really think is a climate-driven system. This one I really think, especially over the last 5,000 years, as we know, and this is my weak attempt to summarize the archaeologic human record for the Willamette Valley, which I wish the archaeologists would please make a better summary of the Willamette Valley human history. I've tried, I'm not an archaeologist, but this is what I got out of everything that's out there, and I worked with Tom Connolly at the University of Oregon trying to glean what I could from the archaeologic record, and what I can get is that at about 5,000 years ago, that's when population increases, that's when they become more sedentary, they start processing food more, especially chemists. That's when we start to find more pit ovens. That's when we start to find just more archaeologic evidence in general. And so that's when, look, that's when somewhere like Beaver Lake that had oak savanna around it, it had prairie, it had the camas, it had the acorns, they would have had a reason to burn around this site. Battleground, they wouldn't have had a reason to burn there. It was closed forest, right? Why would you burn in a closed conifer forest? Okay? This is why I don't think you can just say they burn the entire Willamette Valley every year all the time. All right, last thing I'll show you. I've switched directions on you because a lot of people always ask, why do you guys always plot everything like this? Why can't you plot it like this? It makes a lot more sense. So for my last publication, I plotted things horizontally, and everybody went, oh, yeah, it's a lot easier to read like that. So, and I've also switched to years AD just because to compare to the archaeologic stuff, it's just easier to talk years AD, BC. So here's 800 AD, here's 2000, so basically present or close enough when I took the course. All right, so here's all 5 of my sites from north to south: Battleground, Lake Oswego, Beaver Lake, Porter Lake, Warner Lake. Porter Lake's the really short one. So the black stuff you're seeing, that's all the charcoal counts. The green you're seeing is all the herbaceous charcoal. Okay, so what do you see? What do you see, especially like right about here in most of those cores? Big spikes, right? Yeah, big spike at Battleground, big spike at Beaver, big spike at Porter, big spike at Warner Lake. Those are all of the settlement fires that happen. This is the 1902 Yakult fire that happened at Battleground. This is the land clearance fire around Beaver Lake that cleared it out. Land clearance fire at Porter Lake. This is actually a slash pile fire that got out of control at Warner Lake after they logged the watershed. Okay? But what else do you notice? Especially about Lake Oswego. This is the one that I think is most interesting. Lots and lots and lots and lots of fire until about 1400. And then it just drops off. Yeah, that's the one. There's one, and I wish somebody would go do a huge excavation around Lake Oswego, but it's all private houses, and I doubt it's going to happen. There's one archaeologic site from Lake Oswego that says that humans were living there from about 3,500 years ago until about 300 years ago. And that's exactly, I actually have a longer record from Lake Oswego to back about 3,500 years ago. And look, about 300 years ago is basically when the charcoal disappears. Disease? You know, some people say that disease got here quicker than settlers. I really have no doubt that disease got here sooner than settlers. Lake Oswego was completely surrounded by oak woodland, prairie. Yeah, this would have been a very, I know there's ethnographic evidence. We know that they were living there, and this was a very, very productive environment. It was actually called Sucker Lake before Lake Oswego. Lake Oswego, they built the dam and it extended the lake. Oh, and the reason you don't see the spike here, there was a huge smelter, iron smelter, built on the shores of Lake Oswego. They tore down all the forest, burned it all. You should have a huge charcoal spike, but in 1905, I think, they started piping the Tualatin River through Lake Oswego, completely changed the watershed, completely just, wiped out the signal that probably should have been there in the sediment record. So that's why I think the spike there is missing. Okay. The other one I think is interesting is Warner Lake, and I know I'm probably out of time and I'll stop after this, but Warner Lake. Warner Lake is at 590 meters elevation, so it's about 1,500 feet. It's just as you're going up into the Coburg Hills, heading up into the Cascades. It's one of the few lakes that's in the Coburg Hills. If you've ever been up in the Coburg Hills, there's not a lot of water up there. It's a landslide dam lake. It's a natural lake that's been there for 1,000 years. That's a lot of fire. That is a lot of fire. I do not think there are enough lightning ignition strikes, and I've studied all the papers out there on lightning ignition strikes in the Cascades. I do not think there's enough lightning ignition strikes to get that much fire at Warner Lake. And then look at this. See how it just, 1,800, look at this big hole. There's this big hole, and then this is a slash fire, and then see all the green there? You're picking up grass fires from the valley, from burning of the agricultural fields. So really, fire does stop here at 1,800, and then it's Euro fires after that. There's no archaeologic evidence from Warner Lake, but I would love to know if there's anyone out there who has any ethnographic evidence of trails near this. I swear I read something somewhere of a trail going nearby Warner Lake, but again, it's on Roseboro Lumber Company land, and there just hasn't been much work done there. But I think this is actually a varved sediment lake. Varves are annual laminations in a lake. This is such a high, can you see how closely together all those spikes are? I counted the pollen in this lake at like 5-centimeter intervals. This is a wonderful, wonderful lake record. I think this is just an amazing human burning record, but I don't really have any proof of this. So that's my story. I have to thank all of my, I did put on here like the medieval climate anomaly and the Little Ice Age, because you have to remember that climate change is going on at the same time. So maybe some of the drop-off, like the drop-off at Lake Oswego, it may have had something to do with the Little Ice Age as well. We can't forget that these climate changes were going on at the same time. But I have no doubt that a lot of this fire activity is human-caused. I just don't have a way to correlate a lot of it. So I am learning so much by being here. I hope this fosters more communication between people like me in the paleoecology community and people who have the traditional ecological knowledge, because there's so much that we can learn from each other. So let me just put up my collaborators. Funding from the Joint Fire Sciences Program, which is partially funded by money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I have to thank them very, very heartily for all of the funding for my dissertation research, the National Science Foundation, and all of my field and lab volunteers. Last thing I'll say is I have 2 more projects going. My graduate student, Mike, is here with me. We're going to be taking lake sediment cores from Mount Rainier this summer in the subalpine meadows, looking at the burning of bear grass, and working right next to some archaeologic excavations that have been done up there to really document the fact that the Muckleshoot were burning up there for thousands of years, and to really show that, indeed, they stopped burning, and now all of the subalpine firs are marching into the subalpine meadows and taking over those environments. Also working up in the Sinlaheek, wrong way. There's the Mount Rainier one. This one is the Sinlaheekan Wildlife Area that's up in north central Washington. Same kind of thing, but this is a ponderosa pine, dry forest environment. But again, fire's been removed from the landscape. And we're going to take some lake sediment cores. There's been some tree ring stuff done, and we're going to they're already putting prescribed burning back into the landscape, but they need a longer fire history because, again, this is this is the Colville area, and we know that they were burning here as well, and it's been removed, and Douglas fir and grand fir and other trees are coming in and taking over these ponderosa pine kind of open parklands. So if anybody wants to get involved, I'm always looking for collaborators. So